Hello, I'm today with David Graeber, that you might know of Occupy Wall Street and his work, especially on bureaucracy and the new democracy that we think. I wanted to ask a few questions to David about his work and what you see as happening after Occupy, and if Nous, avons was a sort of follow-up and is a sort of global movement that is actually touching Western democracies, or is there something else to this?
Well, what I find really inspiring about Nous is that people came up with all of the same basic fundamental principles and ideas without really self-consciously imitating it. I think that something happened in 2011. The famous historian and sociologist Emanuel Wallerstein actually speaks of a world revolution of 2011, where it's a little like 1848. Even there were outbreaks everywhere, or 1968. They might not have taken power anywhere, but they changed the very idea of what politics was. Afterwards, nothing was the same. And I think what's really changed is that the idea of what a democratic social movement is has fundamentally changed. Even though people say that Occupy failed, it was suppressed, in fact, almost every large-scale movement contesting power that we've seen since then has taken roughly the same form, whether it's in Bosnia, whether it's in Hong Kong, Turkey, Spain, yeah. Yes, time after time, you get that same basic structure, which is create a space outside of the political order and then try to delegitimate it as a way of applying pressure to it, while simultaneously creating what we call prefigurative politics, a model of what a genuine democracy would be like.
And do you think that this is a new way of doing politics, that somehow this movement will become political forces and challenge the existing parties and the existing democracies as we know them?
Well, it already has. I don't think it's going to challenge it in the sense of creating its own formal political structures, because I think the power of these groups is that they operate outside of those structures, which most people increasingly see as fundamentally corrupt and illegitimate. We have a global administrative bureaucratic structure now, which is answerable to capital, and to a large degree, capital itself operates through those administrative bureaucratic structures. Even profits are largely extracted through political means, through finance, which essentially means artificially creating others' debts, through deregulation, which actually means regulation, in the favor of economic interests. And the political structures and the economic structures of exploitation are so entangled with one another that even if people are not completely cognizant or completely conscious of how it happens, they understand what's going on. And that's why these movements, which reject the entire political order and try to create a space outside it, sort of speak to something that people feel is deeply true.
But this space, we see that elections are still going on, and it will change the game somehow. Yes. Like in Spain, for example, with Podemos coming to be elected at some point. Do you think that there is a space outside of politics, so that there will be a game change? And how long it will take? Because from Occupy, it was in 2011. And now we see that things are slightly changing. It's like the campaign of Bernie Sanders in the US, for example. Can you tell us about the timing on that?
Well, clearly there's a kind of historical lag. I'm coming up with a theory, I'm wearing my sociologist hat, of a 3.5-year lag. If you look at 2008, security forces around the world were gearing up right after 2008 for what they considered to be the inevitable riots and unrest, and then they were surprised that it didn't seem to happen. Then in 2011, all over the world it happens, and not in the places they were first suspected it would. Similarly, right after the often very brutal suppression of those social movements in 2011, everyone was saying, well, of course, these things caught such a popular nerve that they seem to strike such a chord that necessarily politicians would take it up. And at first that didn't seem to happen, but then 3.5 years later, in fact, you see that beginning to occur, and not in almost all the places where there were very, very strong movements outside of occupation, outside the political structure, whether in Spain with Podemos, whether Greece with Syriza, in UK with the change to the Labour Party, Sanders in America. All the places which had their strongest occupations have now seen that happen. The question is how you can have a genuinely constructive synergy between those who are working within the system and those who are trying to create a space of actual democracy outside it. And I think that's the great political question for perhaps the next century, certainly the next decade. No one's quite figured it out. I mean, we've seen models of how not to do it. I think Greece is very much a model of how not to do it. Podemos is you know, it's not clear which way it will go, whether it will really be responsive to the elements that organize prefiguratively outside or not. The same debates are happening right now in the UK. I'm actually working with people in social movements connected to Corbyn and McDonnell and some of the new people in the Labour Party who don't want to co-opt social movements. They want to have a space outside that can create a synergy. But even they say it's actually rather difficult to do.
Okay, and one of your theses that is very interesting is that the bureaucracy is actually not only prerogative of the state, but is very linked to the market and to liberalism. And do you think that the financial crisis that we've seen has actually accelerated this movement of bureaucracy being over democracy, and that now people governing are actually governing through this worldwide bureaucracy?
Well, I think it more exposed what was already happening and made it visible. In a way, what we were doing back in 1999, 2000, 2001 with the global justice movement was trying to make people aware of the existence of this international administrative bureaucratic system. It's kind of planet-wide capitalist bureaucracy that people weren't supposed to be thinking about. You know, they talked about the market, globalization as if it was a product of technology and free trade. But in fact, there was a gigantic infrastructure of really the world's first planetary bureaucratic administrative system. And we were just sort of trying to expose that to the world by showing up whenever those people met and just sort of pointing at them. And it was incredibly effective. It was incredibly effective. And I think 2008 made it utterly clear that, you know, there are institutions which might as well be part of governance because the government will not allow them to collapse no matter what they do, even if they commit the most overt fraud on earth. In fact, you know, I talked to someone who works for one of the Bretton Woods institutions, perhaps it's best not to say which, to talk about why has it that no bankers have gone to jail even though everyone acknowledges they committed outright fraud. He said, well, they like to settle out of court, and where the corporation doesn't admit malfeasance but simply settles with the government and pays a fine. And I said, well, you know, does the fine ever amount to more than they actually got through the fraud? He said, no, of course not. So I said, well, essentially what you're saying is that the government says it's all right to commit fraud as long as you give us our cut. Yeah. And he said, well, I can't put it that way.
Well, but, that's what happened with Panama Papers, for example, that we get names, but before something happens and people are actually judged, we can see a long time happening to that. Yeah, so.
Exactly. I think what really comes out with the Panama Papers is how much these people's ultimate loyalties are to each other. You know, you can have these politicians act like they're arch enemies, either nationally or internationally, but when it comes to what really matters to them, which is the fact that they shouldn't be subject to the laws of their own nations, well, they're willing to back each other up in whatever way they have to.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much, David.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And voilà, c'était en direct de Bercy, en anglais. Bon, vous avez l'Hôtel des Ministres et le Centre Monde de France où David a parlé ce matin. À bientôt.